What if I told you that the most profound myths don't begin in temples or cathedrals, but in the unlikelist of place-crowded stadiums, under city skies, in moments when thousands breathe as one? Picture it. Italy. A summer night heavy with anticipation. The air quivers with chants, drums, and cheers echoing across concrete walls. A soccer match kind where every shout and heartbeat rises like a wave. And then, silence. Not the silence of a goal missed, not the hush of expectation. This silence is different. It falls heavy and complete, as if the very air has been swallowed. The crowd, tens of thousands strong, freezes. Heads tilt upward. Fingers point. Voices die in their throats. Above the pitch, something lingers, brighter than a star, sharper than a spotlight, slower than a jet, yet faster than thought. It hovers just long enough to feel intentional, and then, with a grace that feels unnerving, it moves in patterns across the sky. Perfect geometry, traced as if an unseen hand were sketching on the canvas of night. Triangles, spirals, circles that fold into themselves with mechanical precision. No referee blows a whistle. No announcer dares speak. Only the silence remains, deeper now, threaded with awe and a twinge of fear. 1,000 stories are born in that instant, etched into memory. Don't miss the next mysterious stories. Hit subscribe to Tales Mythology and tap like to support us in bringing more fascinating secrets to light. Subscribe now so you won't miss any journey into myths, mysteries, and chilling tales from around the world. Every like and subscription is a huge motivation for us to keep sharing these hidden stories with you. The weight of collective silence. When we think of myths, we imagine whispered tales passed down across generations, told by firelight, sung by poets, carved into stone. But myth often begins in silence. Collective silence. There is a peculiar weight to thousands of people quiet at once. It is not just absence of noise, it is presence of something else. Something so overwhelming that human sound, for all its power, becomes irrelevant. Anthropologists call this a liminal moment in between, a threshold where ordinary rules don't apply. And in that stadium, the people weren't merely spectators of a match, they became witnesses to a mystery. The pattern above the Vatican. A few nights later, that silence spread, not in a stadium, but in the very heart of Vatican City. Diplomats, clergy, and common witnesses all gazed upward, as more lights appeared, this time not one, but a fleet. They moved with elegance, weaving themselves into deliberate geometry, lattice, interlocking circles, shifting spirals, the kind of precision that left mathematicians weeping with disbelief and artists grasping for metaphors. Again, no explanation came. Astronomers mumbled, government agencies shuffled papers, Vatican officials issued nothing but silence. Yet the memory burned. Here was a spectacle, but it wasn't theatre. It wasn't fireworks. It was something other, unlike the parchment that would surface years later. These lights whispered of watchers, observers from beyond, scribbling warnings across the sky. Myth is born in awe. Why does this matter? Because aware awe, unspeakable awe, is the soil in which myth takes root. Think about it. The Greek poets wrote of gods riding across the heavens, not because they saw Olympus daily, but because they glimpsed lightning storms and felt the raw majesty of nature. The prophet Ezekiel spoke of wheels within wheels, burning with fire, because some vision had shaken him to his core. In Italy, the same alchemy occurred. Stadium lights dimmed before celestial lights. Ordinary spectators became storytellers, and their silence became the ink in which myth would be written. Personal reflection. When I first read about this event, I thought, silence is underrated. We imagine truth screams at us, or revelation strikes with thunder. But sometimes, truth arrives like a hush falling over a crowd. I remembered the time I stood beneath a meteor shower as a teenager. Dozens of streaks rained across the night, too fast to photograph, too sudden to explain. For a few moments, my friends and I stopped talking altogether. That silence wasn't emptiness, it was reverence. And I wonder, perhaps the people in that stadium felt the same. Reverence not for a god they knew, but for a mystery they couldn't name. Why the Vatican matters. The Vatican, of course, has been at the center of countless mysteries. Beneath its marbled floors lie archives stretching over 50 milescent rooms, holding manuscripts no living scholar outside its walls will ever see. Letters of kings, writings of Galileo, records of trials, and some whisper scrolls that rewrite history. When lights appeared above the Vatican, the setting could not have been more poetic. Here was the meeting of sky and scripture, of geometry and theology. The very city built on faith confronted something that seemed to bypass faith altogether, seeming visible, undeniable, yet unexplained. The whisper of the scroll. Years later, when word of the angel scroll leaked, some connected it back to those nights in Italy. The parchment described beings moving in patterns across heavens, slipping between worlds, carrying messages not for comfort, but for warning. And suddenly, the silence of the stadium and the silence of the Vatican made sense not as isolated moments, but as echoes of an older story. Why this hook matters? This is where we begin, not in dusty monasteries or secret libraries, but in silence. A silence that thousands shared. A silence that opened the door to awe. Because the angel scroll is not just about words on parchment. It's about what happens when the ordinary cracks open, when crowds turn their gaze upward, when silence itself becomes holy. And so, before we even unfold the parchment, before we speak of watchers or dimensions or forbidden knowledge, you must remember the silence, because in that silence, myth is born. The cave in the hills, far from the noise of stadiums and city skylines. The story of the angel scroll begins in silence of another kind. Imagine the hills of Jordan, wind scraping over stone, the heat of the day sinking into evening cool. In these hills lie caves that have hidden secrets for centuries, secrets that whisper of gods, angels, and worlds beyond. It was here, in shadows deep enough to swallow even the boldest torchlight, that a group of Benedictine monks stumbled upon something extraordinary. At first glance, it looked like a fragment of old parchment, no different from the thousands of texts scholars had unearthed along the Dead Sea's edge. But when unrolled, under careful hands, the symbols refused to behave like ordinary writing. They twisted, they shimmered, not literally, perhaps, but in the minds of those who stared at them too long. The ink seemed alive, bending the reader's thoughts in ways they couldn't quite describe. The weight of hidden texts. The monks, bound by their vows of preservation and secrecy, carried the parchment away, not to Jerusalem, not to Rome, but to a quiet monastery straddling the border of Germany and Austria. There, they locked it away. Why hide it? Why not show the world? To understand, we must look at history. Hidden texts are not new. In 1945, near Nag Hammadi in Egypt, farmers uncovered jars containing gospels never seen before, writings that challenged what Christianity had taught for centuries. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, painted Jesus not as a distant savior, but as a teacher of hidden wisdom already within us. In the 16th century, conquistadors burned Aztec codices, fearful of knowledge they could not reconcile with their theology. Even within the Vatican itself, shelves stretch 4 miles with sealed document letters of monarchs, banned books, trial records, and perhaps more. The angel scroll fits into this lineage of secrecy. It is not just about faith, it is about control. Knowledge can liberate, but it can also destabilize, and institutions built on stability would worry of anything that might unmoor their foundations. The scroll's first whispers. When word of the scroll finally leaked, it wasn't because a scholar published a paper or a government declassified a file. It was because of death. One of the monks who had guarded the parchment passed away, and with him went a piece of silence. In grief or perhaps in defiance, his brothers whispered fragments of the text to trusted ears. Enough escaped to stir curiosity and suspicion. The passages described not laws or psalms, but visions, dimensions encircling our world, beings neither wholly divine nor wholly mechanical, technologies that blurred the line between sacred and scientific, and warnings, well, his warnings that time itself was not what we believed. The fragility of secrets. I think often about this momentous death of a monk, the loosening of secrecy, It reminds me of how fragile silence really is. We imagine secrets are ironbound, but in truth, they are delicate things. They depend on the living, and the living are always vulnerable. I once met an elderly librarian who confessed she had held on to a family letter for decades that revealed a scandal buried by her ancestors. She had promised never to share it, but when she felt her time slipping away, she admitted, "The dead cannot guard paper. Only the living can," and the living eventually falter. The angel scroll slipped through human hands the same way, not because institutions chose transparency, but because silence cannot endure forever. The scroll's peculiar language. Those who saw fragments of the scroll noted something strange. Its language defied easy translation. The symbols were familiar yet not. Some resembled Aramaic, others Hebrew, and some appeared like no script at all. One scholar described it as if the letters themselves were layered like reading multiple texts at once, one visible, one hidden beneath, and one felt but not seen. Imagine the difficulty of translating something that resists being pinned down, words that behave like mirrors, reflecting back more than they reveal. And here lies another reason for secrecy. A text like this cannot be easily dismissed, but neither can it be easily explained. Better, perhaps, to lock it away than risk chaos in the attempt. Historical parallels, dangerous texts. Throughout history, there have always been writings that frighten the powerful. The Book of Enoch, once beloved in Jewish tradition, described angelic beings who descended to earth, taught forbidden knowledge, and produced offspring with humans. It was eventually excluded from most biblical canons. The Emerald Tablet, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, promised secrets of alchemy and the unity of heaven and earth dangerous enough to be hidden, then rediscovered, then hidden again. Even the Sibylline books of ancient Rome, consulted only in times of crisis, were guarded under lock and key, their secrets too potent for daily eyes. The angel scroll, if real, belongs to this lineage of text, so disruptive that silence feels safer than revelation. The monastery's burden. Picture the monastery that held the scroll, stone walls thick enough to shut out the world, candlelight flickering against shelves of manuscripts, and in a locked chest, a parchment that weighed not in grams, but in consequence. The monks who touched it spoke of unease. Dreams haunted them, visions of gates opening, beings without form, time unraveling like loose thread. Some begged to be reassigned to other duties. Others swore loyalty to the vow of silence, fearing not only for their souls, but for humanity itself. There is a kind of terror that doesn't come from fangs or fire, but from paper. Paper that dares to tell you the world is not what you believe. Why silence persists. As I reflect on this, I find myself torn. Part of me aches for truth. Another part understands the monks. I once visited a private collection in Europe where a curator showed me a medieval text describing medical procedures far ahead of their time. He confessed they had never been published, fearing misuse. Not all knowledge is ready for the world, he said. The angel scroll, with its talk of time manipulation and mechanical angels, carries the same danger. To release it without understanding is to hand matches to children in a library. The scroll is threshold, and yet thresholds beckon. Every locked chest calls to be opened. Every silence begs to be broken. The angel scroll is more than ink on parchment. It is a threshold text, a doorway between worlds, whether literal or metaphorical. To read it is to step where you cannot return unchanged. And perhaps that is why it remains hidden. Because once you step through that threshold, the world you leave behind cannot be reclaimed. When angels aren't what we expect, we inherit a picture of angels from stained glass and lullabyish white wings, kind eyes, a smile that belongs on a winter card. The angel scroll unsettles that comfort. Its beings don't drift on clouds, they operate, as if their presence is the fusion of purpose and precision. In the fragments that circulate, they are watchers, not just guardians or messengers, but observers who intervene with chilling selectivity, stepping into our story not to cradle us, but to correct us. I don't think the ancient world had a tidy word for such a presence. Angel is to tender, machine is to cold. The watcher, as the scroll suggests, is both a hybrid of will and mechanism, the intellect of a theologian, bound to the discipline of a navigator. If the universe is a sea, they are the pilots who already know its currents. And if that's true, then nothing about our timeline is entirely safe. A thread pulled tight. Think of time as a river, and us as swimmers. We learn to move with its force. We measure ourselves by milestone of childhood, vows, departures, returns. But the watcher doesn't swim. The watcher stands on the bank, then in the water, then somehow upstream and downstream at once, stepping between eddies like doorways. This is where the scroll's tone feels less like devotion and more like a field manual. The way it speaks of ascents and layers, portals and thresholds, re-entries and withdrawals. The language is ancient, but the logic is procedural. The author seems to describe encounters not as visions, but as operation entries into zones of light and darkness, reconnaissance across domains, handoffs of knowledge like sealed packets. It's unsettling because it's familiar. The precision reads like a modern logbook. Why time manipulation sounds like myth and method. Whenever we hear time manipulation, we imagine paradoxes and movie tropes. But the scroll's claim is subtler. Time is not merely experienced, it is navigated. If you've ever stood at a grave and felt your past arrive in the present, if ascent can uncork an entire decadethan, you already know time isn't aligned so much as a woven fabric. Pull one thread and you feel tugging across the cloth. The watcher, in this telling, doesn't break time. It folds it, like bringing distant corners of fabric together, to a being outside the weave. Yesterday and tomorrow are less different than we suppose. Is this literal? Metaphorical? The honest answer is, the text won't let us be sure. That ambiguity is part of its power. The mathematics in the sky. We return, for a moment, to geometry above the crowd. Circles that resolve into hexagons. Spirals that dilate with a clockmaker's poise. The angel scroll's descriptions of beings moving in geometric formation sound like choreograph appreciation of intention visible as light. It's tempting to dismiss such reports as misread stars or drones, yet the persistence of this geometric way reappears in different eras. In different mouths demands a second look. If a watcher's medium is movement, then geometry is its grammar. Circles, lattice, wheels within wheel-stoled vocabulary returns, refined. And yes, institutions entwined with secrecy tend to accumulate stories like iron gathers filings. Even popular lore about forbidden devices in the Vatican like the chronovisor, a rumored machine that could view past events reveals how deeply the public associates that archive with time and seeing. The idea is widely disputed and unproven, but the cultural fixation is the point. People instinctively link the Vatican's vaults with technologies or texts that blur time. A bridge from myth to method and back again. There's a tension I feel whenever I read these accounts. We crave evidence, yet we are moved by meaning. The scroll sits precisely at that tension point. It reads like a myth, but insists on method routes through layered heavens, repeatable patterns of ascent, a logic to what looks like wonder. When modern tools start finding hidden writing inside sealed, fragile scrolls, ones we thought were lost forever, the boundary between mythic recovery and technical recovery blurs in the best way. AI is now unrolling texts virtually and teasing out letters deep within carbonized papyri, revealing voices trapped for millennia. If technology can resurrect lost words from ash, perhaps we should be slower to scoff at legends about hidden words in vaults. Recent work showcased on glass highlights how ML and CT scanning reconstructed thousands of letters from the Herculaneum scrolls, reframing what lost even means. No, this doesn't prove the angel scroll exists, but it proves something else. Our capacity to retrieve the nearly irretrievable is growing, and with it, our appetite for layered truths. A watcher's briefing. If you could see what they see, imagine a memo from a watcher. The kind you never get to read. Objective, stabilize a thread at risk of fraying. Method, enter at the Hingian hour where minds are open, because awe has disarmed them. Constraints, do not overwrite choice. Nudge, realign, withdraw. Metrics, not compliance, but coherence, reappearance of a pattern that allows future choices to remain free. This is what chills me about the Watcher concept. It isn't merely power, it's policy. A being with both capability and restraint unsettles us because it suggests a scale of ethics beyond our own, one that treats centuries as a single conversation, a story from the archives, whispered, not filed. Years ago, an acquaintance who worked adjacent to a European ecclesiastical library in a thing as grand as the Vatican told me a story that still needles me. A visiting scholar asked to see a minor codex rumored to contain methodological prayers, not invocations to plead with heaven, but protocols for aligning the self with something. The request was denied politely. Later, in the yard, the librarian simply said, "We avoid texts that teach mechanics of the hidden world. We prefer texts that teach humility before it. Whether that codex exists, I can't say. But the logic matches the Angel Scrolls' anxiety. Mechanics without humility, a torch in dry timber. Time, as lived by ordinary people. Let's come down from the vaults. If the Watchers fall time, how does that touch us? A mother dreams of a warning and wakes in time to turn off the gas. A commuter pauses for a dropped glove and misses the train that later stalls. A scientist reads a line written centuries earlier and feels a future discovery turn, like a key already cut. We typically file such moments under coincidence, but a mythic consciousness says sometimes coherence is granted to save us from every sorrow, but to weave us into a story other than our panic. If Watchers exist, their interventions may be smaller than spectacle and larger than luck. Their signature might be timing. The Watcher and the covenant of distance. Across traditions, the holy often keeps a measured distance, a cloud at the edge of the camp, a still small voice, a messenger who will not stay. The Watcher's distance is not indifference, it is covenant. Step in too far, and freedom collapses. Step back too far, and meaning thins. So interventions, if they happen, arrive as edges, a formation above a stadium, a dream that loosens a stubborn doubt, a page that seems to find you. It's no accident the scroll speaks of thresholds and gates. Thresholds respect the room you're in, and the room you might enter. They never drag you across. What terrifies the keepers? Here is the quiet terror for archivists, monks, and curators alike, a text that doesn't just describe the threshold, but teaches you how to cross it. It's one thing to tell people there are other rooms. It's another to give them the knob and instructions. When rumors cling to the Vatican, it's miles of shelving, the whispered inventories of things man should not know. Even the lurid pop culture lists of creepiest secrets, which mix speculation with exaggeration. What they reveal most isn't fact but fear. The fear that somewhere a document exists that would let ordinary people act like Watchers opening doors, without the character to walk through them safely. If the Watchers are still watching, the scroll hints at ongoing attention, not a single incursion in a distant age, but a patient surveillance. That word feels sinister. But what if the point is stewardship, not control? What if the continuity across centuries is less about puppetry and more about guardrailsable realignments that keep our species from tearing the fabric that holds us? I don't know. No one does. But I'm convinced this is why the story has teeth. It dignifies history. It says our choices matter enough to attract attention. The question we can't avoid. If you could write to a Watcher, what would you ask? Tell me where the thread should go. Unravel what binds me. Show me what I refuse to see. The scroll's implied answer is maddening and merciful. You must walk. The diagrams, the ascents, the geometry, they may be maps, but they do not replace pilgrimage. The Watcher reveals pathways. You supply will. And that might be the most radical claim of all. In a world hungry for spectacle, the scroll treasures practicing attention, humility, timing, restraint. The mechanics are there, but the music is in how you use them. Transition to what comes next. So the Watchers clear their throats in light and angle, and the stadium goes quiet. The monks unroll a text and the walls breathe. The Vatican remains silent, and the world fills the silence with rumor. And somewhere between fear and fascination, the scroll invites us to consider time as rooms within rooms, doors within doors. Next, we'll step closer to the ground, witness stories and real-life echoes not to prove, but to pattern. Because when a pattern repeats across centuries and across people, disbelief doesn't vanish, but it does acquire manners. Why witnesses matter. When people hear about the Angel Scroll, it can sound like myth piled on myth. A mysterious parchment here, some monks there, a Vatican silence for seasoning. But myths don't endure on parchment alone. They survive because people claim to see things with their own eyes, things that leave them trembling, certain, forever changed. And so, we turn to the stories. Real voices, real visions, accounts that either echo the scroll or create the very echoes it describes. The stadium lights revisited. Let's return, for a moment, to the stadium in Italy. I found a description by a retired coach who was there that night. He wasn't prone to superstition. He spent decades thinking in formations, passes, defenses. But his memory of that night was not about the game. He said, "I knew every light in that stadium. I knew how they moved, when they flickered. But that light above us, no bulb, no beam, no plane moved like it was deliberate. It wasn't searching, it was watching. What struck me was not the detail but the tone. His words were soft, not sensational, almost reverent. When entire crowds freeze together, skeptics often blame mass hysteria. And sometimes that's true. But hysteria usually spreads shouts, panic, motion. That night produced silence, stillness, shared awe. Something about that difference makes me think the coach's memory was less hysteria, more helloing. Lights over the Vatican. Days later, the pattern deepened. Diplomats in Vatican City, accustomed to routine briefings, dinners, prayers, looked up and saw a fleet. Not warm glowing sphere, but dozens. They did not scatter like birds or drift like balloons. They flew in formation, etching geometry in the sky. I imagine what that must have felt like. The center of Christendom suddenly overshadowed by shapes no scripture could fully account for. Priests watching silently, officials clutching folders of diplomacy, suddenly aware that another diplomatio not of nations, but of dimensions might already be in play. Again, silence followed. No bulletins, no clarifications, only whispers and memories. The Fatima parallel. This wasn't the first time the skies above faith's heartlands drew awe and dread. In 1917, in Fatima, Portugal, thousands gathered after children claimed visions of a radiant lady. What followed is known as the miracle of the sun. Witnesses said the sun itself danced. It spun, it zigzagged, it shimmered in colors. Some swore it plunged toward Earth before retreating. Scientists today argue atmospheric optics, but the sheer number of witness peasants, scholars, skeptics, clergy makes dismissal difficult. What's striking is not the explanation, but the echo. Crowds united in silence, eyes turned skyward, geometry written in light. The Angel Scroll describes watchers moving in formations, bending perception, ushering visions that cross the boundary of faith and physics. Fatima feels less like an exception, more like a pattern repeating. Ezekiel's wheels. Centuries earlier, the prophet Ezekiel described a vision by the river Chebar. Wheels within wheels, radiant, rimmed with eyes. For millennia, theologians called it a metaphor for divine omniscience. But read it beside modern UFO descriptions, and you notice unsettling parallels. This doesn't mean Ezekiel saw spacecraft. It means human beings across centuries describe the unknown in strangely consistent geometries. Circles, spirals, radiant eyes of light. Whether watchers, angels, or aerial phenomena, the grammar recurs. A whispered story from an archivist. I once spoke to a researcher who claimed an acquaintance in the Vatican library confided something to him. He told me this story with hesitation, as if he wasn't sure whether to trust the words himself. The archivist supposedly said, "We do not deny such a scroll exists. We deny access, because the pages describe beings not as metaphors, but as mechanics. That is not faith. That is danger." Now, is this reliable testimony? Perhaps not. Archivists guard secrets, but they also guard myths, and myths, when told in whispers, are often heavier than facts. Yet even as rumor, the story reveals something. People inside the walls sense the weight of such a text. They may not confirm it, but they feel it. And that feeling seeps outward, fueling speculation. The geometry of memory. I've never seen lights over the Vatican, but I once stood on a hillside in rural Spain during a meteor shower. Dozens of strangers gathered, strangers who had nothing in common except skyward eyes. When the streaks began first, brilliant, synchronized crowd gasped as one, then fell silent. It wasn't hysteria. It wasn't chaos. It was geometry in memory. A shared pattern etched into 1,000 minds at once. Even if you explained the astronomy, the moment remained mystical. And that's what fascinates me about witness stories. It's not about proving or disproving. It's about how the experience marks those present, shaping their sense of mystery forever. Patterns across cultures, from Japan's kappa apparitions along rivers to the Hopi legends of the Kushina spirits, cultures across the globe tell of luminous figures, mechanical sounding entities, beings that instruct or warn, an aerial phenomena linked to cosmic order. The angel scroll seems less like a lone aberration, and more like another thread in this vast global tapestry. A tapestry where beings from beyond are not anomalies, but recurring visitors sapering in language suited to each age. Gods, angels, watchers, aliens, skepticism and echoes. Skeptics rightly remind us, eyewitness testimony is fallible. Memory distorts. People crave meaning in randomness, and yet, when distortions across centuries distort in the same direction, something demands attention. Like multiple artists painting different versions of a landscape, they've all glimpsed from different angles. No painting matches perfectly, but all insist on a mountain at the horizon. So it is with watchers. Whether described as wheels, angels, UFOs, or lights, the mountain remains. Why I believe stories matter. I don't argue for literal truth in every witness story. What I argue for is their value. Stories are not accidents, they are containers for the human encounter with mystery. Even if the angel scroll were proven a forgery tomorrow, its power would endure because it resonates with real human experiences, silence in stadiums, visions of light, fear at the threshold of the unknown, and that resonance cannot be dismissed as fabrication. It is the echo of awe. Now we've walked through the voices of witnesses, the coach in the stadium, the diplomats in Rome, the children in Fatima, the prophet in Babylon. Their echoes braid into a single unsettling question. If so many have seen, across so long a span, then what if anything lies behind the repetition? That question carries us forward, into the heart of the scroll itself, not just what was seen, but what was written. Forbidden knowledge it dared to preserve. Knowledge that burns. Every culture tells stories about knowledge that should never have been touched. Prometheus stealing fire, Adam and Eve tasting the fruit of the tree, Pandora opening her jar. The angel scroll, if we believe its whispers, belongs to this family of forbidden texts, not a hymn to comfort the soul, not a law to guide daily life, but a manual describing powers beyond comprehension, the mechanics of time, gates between realms, technologies unknown to antiquity. The scroll is said to describe how watchers moved between dimensions, how they used chariots of fire not as metaphor, but as device vehicles of luminous design that could ascend through heavens like staircases. It speaks of gates that open not to visions, but to places. To read such a text is not like reading scripture. It's like peeking into an instruction book written for something not human. And that's why it terrifies. Because humans have always been clever enough to use knowledge, but rarely wise enough to wield it. Parallels across history. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mesoamerica, they found codice-painted manuscripts counting astronomical cycles, rituals, histories. These books weren't myths in the European sense. They were records of knowledge. To the conquistadors, they looked like sorcery. Many were burned. In Alexandria, the library once held thousands of scrolls. Accounts differ about how it was destroyed. But the theme persists. Too much knowledge, too concentrated, attracts fire. Even in medieval Europe, texts deemed heretical were not debated, but buried or burned. The instinct is consistent. Dangerous knowledge must be hidden. The Angel Scroll, with its strange blend of vision and procedure, sits perfectly in this pattern. The scroll's warnings. Those who claim to have glimpsed the scroll insist it does not only describe power, it warns against it. The Watchers are not celebrated, they are feared. The text implies their interference with humanity lead to catastrophes born of unions between Watchers and humans, knowledge of metallurgy, medicine, and astrology given too soon, disasters unleashed. It's as if the scroll whispers, yes, you can learn this, but you will pay a price. This is the pattern of forbidden knowledge. It is never forbidden because it is false. It is forbidden because it is true enough to tempt, and dangerous enough to destroy. Why we reach anyway. I remember standing in a science museum once, staring at the replica of the first nuclear reactor. A plaque said something like, "This was the moment humanity learned to harness the atom," and I thought, was it harness, or was it unkind? Oppenheimer, after the first bomb test, quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." That's the essence of forbidden knowledge. You don't know if you've harnessed it until it's too late. When I think of the Angel Scroll, I imagine monks reading lines about bending time or opening gates and feeling the same dread. Now we have seen too much. The allure of the forbiddance. But here's the paradox. The more you label something forbiddance, the more magnetic it becomes. Tell a child not to touch the flame, and they inch closer. Tell a scientist a field is off limits, and curiosity sharpens. That's the danger of the Angel Scroll. Lock it in a monastery, seal it in Vatican shells, whisper rumors of its power, and suddenly it becomes irresistible, not because it is proven, but because it is denied. Every rumor fuels more desire to see what's hidden. Every silence thunders louder than denial. Cross-cultural echoes. Forbidden knowledge appears everywhere. In Hindu myth, the god Shiva carries the fire of destruction, a power too vast for mortals. In Jewish tradition, the mystics who ventured too far into esoteric knowledge desomatized never returned sane. In Greek lore, Orpheus was told never to look back as he led Eurydice from the underworld. He did, and lost her forever. These stories don't say knowledge is evil. They say timing and readiness matter. To receive power too soon is to invite ruin. The Angel Scroll's uncomfortable detail. Accounts of the scroll describe passages so technical they read almost like instructions. One fragment, often cited, describes a chariot that ascends the layers of heaven, its wheels interlocked with flame, its rider lifted not by wings, but by mechanism. Imagine monks reading that 1,000 years ago. To them, it would sound like blasphemy. To us, it sounds like technology disguised in metaphor. But either way, the message is the same. This was not meant for ordinary eyes. The locked drawer. Years ago, a professor of mine admitted he had manuscripts in his office that he refused to show students, not because they were secret, but because they contained rituals and invocations he believed could disturb young minds. He told me, knowledge is not always meant to be read. Sometimes it is meant to be respected at a distance. I didn't understand then. Now, thinking of the Angel Scroll, I do. The forbiddance is not always hidden because of selfishness. Sometimes it is hidden out of mercy. Why the Vatican may stay silent. This is why, perhaps, the Vatican says nothing. Imagine being an institution tasked with preserving faith for over 1 billion people. Would you release a document describing angels as mechanical, time-folding entities? Would you risk destabilizing the very foundation of worship, prayer, hope? Silence is not proof of guilt, but it is proof of weight. If the scroll exists, its weight is measured not in parchment, but in consequence. Transition. So here we stand, at the edge of the scroll's warnings. It tells of knowledge that burns, truths that tempt, gates that open onto nightmares. The question is not only what the scroll says, but why it must remain hidden. And that carries us into our next chapter, not the text itself, but the silence around the Vatican's refusal to speak, the thunder of denial by omission. When silence speaks louder than words, in most of life, silence feels like absence. A pause in conversation, a gap in a speech, the hush after music ends. But in matters of secrecy, silence roars. It is not emptiness, but wait. When the Vatican refuses to comment on the angel scroller, on countless other whispered artifacts, it doesn't dispel curiosity. It intensifies it. A denial can close a door. Silence leaves it wide open, forcing us to imagine what might be hiding inside. And in the case of the angel scroll, silence has become the loudest statement of all. Why silence endures? The Vatican has spent centuries curating, preserving, and yes, concealing its archive. A labyrinth of shelves stretching for miles holds documents from emperors, popes, kings, scientists, letters of Galileo under trial, reports of wars, correspondence about miracles and heresies. But not all archives are for sharing. Many are locked, some indefinitely. The reason? Stability. Faith depends on continuity. A disruptive textstone that portrays angels as mechanical entities manipulating time could fracture trust. It might not matter whether the scroll is authentic. The doubt it introduces would be enough. Institutions are not built for risk. They are built to endure. And entrance often means silence. Historical precedent. The Galileo affair. Consider Galileo. When he argued that the earth revolved around the sun, the Vatican silenced him, not because telescopes were evil, but because the shift threatened an entire theological structure. To release such a truth without preparation would risk unraveling centuries of doctrine. So they hushed him. His ideas survived anyway, but not without struggle, not without pain. Now imagine the angel scroll. If the church suppressed a scientist for suggesting Earth moved around the sun, how much more would it suppress a parchment suggesting time itself could be bent by angelic mechanics? The power of denial by absence. There is a subtle art in how institutions handle disruptive claims. Denial risks drawing attention. Confirmation risks upheaval. Silence allows mystery to grow, while preserving plausible deniability. In politics, this is called strategic ambiguity. In faith, it is called prudence. In both, it is a tool for control. By refusing to speak of the angel scroll, the Vatican gains power. Every rumor grows in shadow. Every speculation adds to the mystique. And mystique, ironically, strengthens the authority of the silent. The silence I've known. I once asked a museum curator if he believed in the authenticity of a certain relic locked away in storage. He looked at me for a long time, then said only, "The question is not whether it's authentic. The question is what would happen if I said it was." That response has haunted me ever since. The point wasn't truth, it was consequence. Institutions weigh truth not by accuracy, but by impact. The Vatican, I suspect, does the same with the angel scroll. The cost of silence. But silence has its dangers too. It breeds mistrust. When people sense secrets are being kept, they fill the gaps with their own spurious conspiracies, exaggerations, myths. The angel scroll may or may not exist in Vatican vaults, but Vatican silence ensures that the idea of it will never die. People will imagine it, write about it, fear it, and demand answers. This is the paradox. In trying to protect stability, silence may create more instability than revelation would. Other stories of concealment. The angel scroll is not the only rumor haunting those shelves. Some claim the Vatican hides documents about Jesus' lost years. Others whisper of prophecies locked away, never shared with the public. Popular lore exaggerated, but telling paints the archive as a place of suppressed miracles, hidden gospels, even devices like the fabled chronovisor, said to view history itself. Most of these claims remain unproven, but the very fact they persist reveals how much people expect the Vatican to keep silent. Silence is fertile soil for rumor, the human side of silence. I sometimes wonder what it feels like to be an archivist in those halls, to walk between shelves stretching endlessly, to hold documents that could rewrite history, and to know you cannot speak. Does the silence weigh like guilt, or does it feel like guardianship? Do they believe they are protecting the faithful, protecting faith itself? The truth may be both. Silence is rarely simple. It is both shield and prison. A locked library. Years ago, I visited a private library in Europe. I was shown room after room of rare manuscripts, but one door remained closed. When I asked what lay beyond it, the librarian smiled. Some knowledge is preserved not for today, but for when tomorrow is ready. That sentence has stayed with me. Knowledge locked away is not always lost, it is waiting for the right time, or perhaps for the right maturity. Maybe the Vatican feels the same. The angel scroll may not be suppressed forever. Perhaps it is simply waiting for a tomorrow we have not reached. Silence as a test. There's another possibility. Perhaps the scroll itself warns against release. Perhaps its message is so dire that the only faithful response is silence. If the text itself says, "Do not share this until the time is right," then the silence is not suppression but obedience. This is speculation, yes, but it's the kind of speculation silence provokes. Transition. So the Vatican keeps its silence. Whether out of fear, prudence, guardianship, or obedience, the result is the same. The angel scroll remains in shadows. And shadows, as we know, make everything larger. But what of the warnings themselves? If the scroll does speak, what does it tell us about the cost of knowledge, the fragility of time, the dangers of looking too far? That question brings us to the scroll's most chilling passage as its cosmic warnings, its declaration that knowledge is not always a blessing, but an eclipse. The warning woven in ink. Every fragment of the angel scroll, if the stories are to be believed, circles back to one unsettling theme. Knowledge has a price, not just any knowledge, knowledge of thresholds, of time's fabric, of the mechanics behind the divine curtain. It describes visions, where the traveler is lifted beyond clouds and shown endless worlds, their watchers silent, patient, and then comes the line that chills. The time of unveiling draws near, when nothing hidden shall remain unseen. That sounds triumphant at first, like a promise of revelation, but beneath it lies dread. What if unveiling is not salvation, but rupture? What if to see everything is to unravel the meaning of anything? Knowledge as eclipse. Most traditions treat knowledge as light, enlightenment, illumination, revelation. But the angel scroll flips the metaphor. It says, knowledge is not always soon, it is sometimes eclipse. Think of an eclipse. It is not darkness alone. It is darkness that comes from too much alignment, too much precision. The sun is still there, but blotted out, its brilliance transformed into a ring of fire. That's what forbidden knowledge does. It doesn't vanish truth. It overexposes it, blinds by alignment, overwhelms with clarity. And suddenly, the seeker is not illuminated, but darkened by too much sight. Oppenheimer's shadow. I cannot think of this warning without recalling Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. When he watched the first detonation, he quoted scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It wasn't triumph in his voice, it was terror. He had seen the eclipse of knowledge. Science gave him fire, but it burned too hot, too wide. The angel scroll seems to anticipate this human pattern, to know how to bend time, how to pierce veils, how to summon beings or might achieve it, but the achievement could eclipse us, blotting out not just ignorance but innocence. Personal reflection. My small eclipse. When I was younger, I once peered at a solar eclipse without proper protection. 4 days after, my vision was marked by dark spots. I hadn't gone blind, but I had scarred my sight. That, I think, is what the scroll warns. Knowledge without readiness is like staring into a sun you cannot endure. It leaves marks that never fade. The scroll's chilling passages. Accounts of the text describe harrowing visions. A traveler lifted by a prince of angels, shown countless worlds where past, present, and future unfolded all at once. Realities layered like mirrors, fragile and infinite. Entities without bodies, voices without words, guiding or commanding with silence alone. To read such passages is to confront not comfort, but destabilization. It is not a sermon, it is a shattering. Science meets myth. What fascinates me is how these warnings echo modern science. Quantum physics tells us observation itself changes outcomes. Cosmology hints at multiverses layered beyond sight. Philosophy wrestles with whether time is a river or a tapestry. The angel scroll seems to anticipate these debates, not in equations, but in visions. And its warning is timeless. Just because you can peer into hidden structures does not mean you should. The dread of too much seeing. Imagine if tomorrow we discovered undeniable proof that watchers existed, that they moved in geometry above us, that they bent time. Would that knowledge empower you to paralyze us? Faith would fracture. Science would scramble. Daily life might never feel ordinary again. Sometimes, not knowing is what keeps us steady. Sometimes, ignorance is not failure but mercy. A forbidden box. When I was a child, my grandmother kept a small wooden box on a shelf. She told me never to open it. Of course, one day I did. Inside were letters from decades past, love lost, betrayal, grief. The contents weren't supernatural, but they changed how I saw her. The woman I thought unshakable became suddenly human, fragile. The box had given me knowledge, but it hadn't enlightened me, it had eclipsed my simple faith in who she was. The angel scroll feels like that. A box opened too soon, revealing truths that might eclipse our capacity to love, believe, or endure. The silence that protects. Perhaps this is why the Vatican or the monastery, or whoever guards it, chooses silence, not to hold power, but to protect humanity from eclipse. It's easy to cry conspiracy. It's harder to admit mercy. What if silence is not suppression, but kindness, transition? And yet, the eclipse looms, because knowledge, like the sun, always finds a way to shine. We may try to hide it, but cracks in silence leak light, and once light leaks, shadows follow. So the angel scroll's warning is not simply about gates and watchers. It is about us, our hunger for truth, our blindness to consequence, our willingness to chase what dazzles even if it burns. Which leads us to the end of the scroll and to the question we cannot avoid. If the watchers are real, if the scroll is true, if the gates are waiting, what happens when the lock finally breaks? The scroll endures. We've journeyed through stadium lights, hidden monasteries, watchers beyond time, whispered archives, forbidden knowledge, and cosmic warnings. And yet, one truth remains constant. The angel scroll endures in silence. Whether locked beneath Vatican marble, hidden in a border monastery, or existing only in rumor, its weight is undeniable. Not the weight of paper, but of possibility. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones proven true, but the ones that refuse to die. Why we chase secrets. Humanity has always chased secrets. We dug into caves for scrolls, built telescopes for stars, cracked atoms, coded genomes, always seeking, always stretching. Why? Because curiosity is sacred. To wonder is to be human. To stand at the edge of the unknown and lean forward it is our most dangerous and most beautiful trait. The angel scroll, real or imagined, symbolizes that hunger. It dares us to ask, what lies beyond? What truth hides in silence? What knowledge waits for us, shimmering just out of reach? The paradox of knowledge. But here's the paradox. Knowledge is both gift and burden. Every discovery enlarges us and endangers us. Fire warms and burns. Metal heals and wounds. The atom lights cities and levels them. The angel scroll reminds us, some truths eclipse as much as they illuminate. To seek them is noble, but to receive them requires humility. Personal reflection, a small lesson. I think back to that stadium silence we began with. Thousands staring upward, united not by sport, but by awe. No words, no panic, just reverence. That, perhaps, is the lesson. The world's mysteries don't always demand immediate answers. Sometimes, they ask us to be silent, to pause, to feel wonder before we dissect it. The monks who guarded the scroll may not have been conspirators. They may simply have been guardians of that silence, protectors of mystery, not hoarding, but humbling. The takeaway. So what do we do with the angel scroll, with its watchers, its warnings, its silence? We take away not proof, but pasture. Approach mystery with curiosity, but also reverence. Seek knowledge, but carry humility. Remember that silence itself can be sacred. Not every secret is meant to be rushed into light. Because in the end, the angel scroll's greatest gift may not be its hidden words, but its haunting reminder Not all that is hidden must be revealed, at least, not yet. As the scroll whispers across time, as silence echoes louder than speech, as watchers move unseen, we are left with a choice: chase knowledge recklessly, or walk toward it carefully, with awe as our lantern. The lock will break one day, whether by human hands, divine will, or sheer accident. When it does, the question is not whether we'll be ready for the scroll. The question is whether the scroll will be ready for us. Until then, the angel scroll endures myth, half memory, wholly mystery, and so do we.